Advocating for an FASD-Informed IEP, a series of compact trainings for parents. This training was originally presented to a live audience in the fall of 2024 and have been divided into smaller sections here in order for participants to access the sections they choose in the order they prefer. IEP Assessments, Part 1 in the Advocating for an FASD-Informed IEP series. We're going to start with assessments because that's typically the beginning of an IEP process. It starts with getting the student assessed for their different areas of need, suspected need. And we want to set the assessors up for success by giving them as much pertinent information as possible. So we want to start by describing our child's brain-based disability. What does that look like? What kind of processing challenges do they have? And really use terminology that brings it back to the understanding of the brain and central nervous system. In order to do that, we can use terms such as neurodevelopmental. So it's looking again at the neurology and the body and how our body develops and how the neurological system develops. We want to describe FASD as a whole body disability and how that impacts the various aspects of the student's functioning. And different things that we talked about before is like if the student has challenges around the way they walk, so their balance could be off, something like that. Even that is going to be impactful when we're thinking about what they need in an IEP, and it may not be something that, again, is easily visible or easily understood unless we bring that attention, bring that information to the school's attention during the assessment process. We want to make note, again, of those on and off days or on and off moments. We want to talk about how typical that is for this population, that sometimes connections are being made in the brain and sometimes they're not, and it's very common for that to ebb and flow. We also want to describe the specific suspected concerns or needs that are related to the individual student. And it's helpful to use that term suspected, that we suspect these areas of disability with the child, because that's the terminology that's used in the law. We also want, whenever possible, to include a diagnosis or confirmation of FASD, because that can help set up the structure for noting the need for FASD-informed interventions. However, there are times when that's not feasible, or the family might not be comfortable sharing that information for a variety of reasons. So if there's not a diagnosis or confirmation, or that's not feasible to include in there, we can still look at the patterns of behaviors, the symptoms, the challenges that that student is facing, and really identify whether they're similar to a student with FASD. And if they are, then they might benefit from similar interventions. So even if there's no specific diagnosis or confirmation, you can use a lot of the strategies that we're going to go over today to still help advocate for a supportive IEP for your student. We put a link on here for a template if you're in the process of requesting an assessment, an initial assessment for your student. There's a template on our website that you can download that will give you some specific language that might be helpful when doing so. So, Child Find is part of IDEA, the national law that governs special education services in the US. And that requires that schools assess in all areas of suspected disability. So that's that word again, right? So the items listed on this slide are not necessarily the only areas of need for your child, nor will every child with FASD have needs in all of these areas. However, these are areas where students with FASD will commonly find challenges that impact their educational functioning. And so we want to bring them to your attention to consider when requesting assessments for your student. Now, most school assessments begin with a psychoeducational assessment. A neuropsychological assessment utilizes testing measures that are more attuned to the brain functionings that are contributing to the student's underlying challenges. Most schools will not have a neuropsychologist on staff, but describing those the brain-based nature of your child's disability can really help the school decide whether they need to refer out to another assessor or whether they might need to get consultation from an assessor who's more experienced with FASD or an outside expert. And if the school does not effectively or appropriately assess all of your child's suspected areas of disability, including how their brain functioning is really impacting their ability to learn and participate in their educational programming, then having solid documentation of those needs in your request for the assessment can support a due process case in the future. So again, you want to help the assessor gain the information and understand if they need outside support, that then they have the ability to request that. And if the school does not end up doing that and does not actually meet the needs or identify the needs effectively, it then creates a more robust case for you to follow up on. I included FBAs briefly here in parentheses. It can be a little dicey for our kids with FASD because the FBAs often look at the surface level behaviors and not the underlying needs. Now, it depends on who's doing the FBA. There are some that are much more in depth and really do try to look for those underlying needs. So it really varies depending on who's doing the assessment. But if the true underlying need is determined, then that process can be very helpful. When we look at cognitive or intellectual skills, these are typically assessed in any IEP assessment process in most, not all of them, but in most. And it can be helpful in gathering information about how your child thinks, how they problem solve, and how they understand information. Not all cognitive or intellectual tests measure the same things. So we'll talk about some of the specific areas that many students with FASD have difficulties with so that you can target those individually with your requests if needed, as well as instead of just lumping them under the generalized kind of cognitive testing umbrella, which sometimes just doesn't get to the specific nuances of some of the areas that we really want to look at with students with FASD. So academic and achievement testing, that's looking at the academic work required in school and whether your child, kind of where your child excels with those or where they struggle. And students with FASD tend to have a very specific challenge with mathematics. It tends to be a very significant deficit with this population. So it's definitely an area to look into. Executive functioning tends to be a challenge, and that looks at the abilities, such as the ability to plan, organize, pay attention, avoid distractions, like including our ability to inhibit actions when we need to. So to not act on something, even though it comes into our brain. When it comes to assessing memory, it'll be important for the assessor to really ensure that they look at many different types of memory. So we want to look at working memory, at short-term memory, at long-term memory, and at things like episodic memory, which is looking at encoding and storage and retrieval of personally experienced events that tend to have a kind of spatial and temporal context. So remembering your first phone number or the first time you heard a certain song, where you parked your car, things like that tend to be more episodic memory. Memory is a nearly universal challenge for individuals with FASD, but the type of memory challenges will vary from one individual to another. So really diving into this aspect of the assessment can be really helpful. And there are many different aspects of how we process information that can be really valuable for the IEP team. So ensuring that we're assessing visual processing, auditory processing, looking at the processing speed in each of those areas, looking at how the student is able to sequence events, one thing and then another and then another, and be able to keep track of that. And being able to generalize from one environment to another, those are all really important aspects to look at with this population. Adaptive skills are those that are needed for day-to-day functioning. And I've highlighted this section because it's an absolute must for evaluation for students with FASD. Regardless of the student's cognitive abilities, adaptive skills are often very challenging for this population. And most school psychologists are not trained to consider adaptive measures when cognitive scores are in the average range. And so it's important for families to know that they can ask for this directly for their student to have their adaptive skills measured as part of the assessments. Social skills can be an area of deficit and is something that both the school psychologist and the speech and language therapist might be able to assess. And they might do it a little bit differently. So sometimes it's helpful to have that overlap and that multidisciplinary perspective. There are a variety of mental health needs that can develop from the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure on the brain, and they can also develop from individuals' life experiences. And so anxiety, depression, and trauma are listed here. These are just some of the ones that are especially pertinent to evaluate so that appropriate supports can really be put in place if needed. While kids with FASD often talk well, and appear on the surface level to have strong language abilities, many struggle with receptive language and pragmatics. So a thorough speech and language evaluation from a qualified speech and language pathologist is an essential component of assessment for students with FASD. An occupational therapy assessment can look at sensory processing, as well as fine motor needs and possible dyspraxia, which impacts movement and coordination, and maybe a key component to really understanding the child's educational needs. Assistive technology is a component of the IEP that's supposed to be addressed at every IEP meeting. And many families out there will likely know that that has not been their experience, and that it sometimes gets skipped. And so asking for an assessment in this area specifically can be helpful for students with FASD in order to learn more about how to support their learning needs and ensure that they can effectively access their educational programming. AT, assistive technology, can be low tech, it can be high tech, it can be anywhere in between, but it allows the student to access their curriculum and learning in ways that might otherwise not have been, that they might otherwise have not have been able to do so. So this is one of the assessment areas that may sometimes benefit from waiting until the initial assessments are complete to get a thorough understanding of how the student processes and accesses information in their educational setting, so that then the AT assessment can be targeted to those specific needs. So it can be done with the initial assessment. It may be worthwhile to hold off and then request that after the IEP team sees where it might be most needed. Transition assessment should happen before the child's 16th birthday, and some school districts will mandate that earlier. I recommend beginning to think of these needs as early as possible and tie them into the educational programming from early on. Two other aspects of assessment that I wanted to cover are ensuring that there's observations and feedback that come directly from the classroom instructor, and including their perspective of the student's needs and work samples that the student has created in class can be really helpful with regard to getting an overall view of how the student functions in the educational setting. There are some kids that do really well in testing, which is typically done in a quiet space, one-on-one with the assessor, but that struggle in a classroom setting, which may not be as quiet or supportive of a setting. And others kind of go the other way. Others may struggle with demonstrating their knowledge on formal assessments, but can do the classwork when it's presented in a way that's aligned with how they learn. So getting the formal assessments, getting classroom feedback from the teacher, observations, classwork, things like that, as well as from the family, can make a world of difference. Statements like, he can do it when he tries, she can do it when she wants to. Those kind of statements are frequently heard by families, and I see them frequently, unfortunately, written into the educational records as well. But they're indicative of a perception that the student's challenges are due to behavioral issues or lack of motivation or social maladjustment, rather than an understanding of the brain-based nature of FASD. And when we have inaccurate understanding, that leads to misidentification and then ineffective interventions. So the assessment process is an opportunity for us to educate the school professionals on the nature of this disability. We want them to have all the information necessary to create an appropriate and supportive IEP document. So during the process, we want to remind them to think brain, not behavior. Again, pulling it back to that brain-based disability. We can help them understand the internal, kind of invisible physical manifestations. So when assessments of the specific brain areas impacted are available, or if the team is able to do a really thorough analysis of the assessment results with brain functioning in mind, we can then use this information to document the brain processes that are impacted in this individual student and how this contributes to the student's educational functioning, both their strengths and their struggles, and then use this information to inform how the IEP team approaches the creation of appropriate supports and services. The hidden physical disabilities, so not just the brain and central nervous system, but heart functioning, other internal organs, things like that, can also have an educational impact. And so those need to be considered as well. Sometimes it's easy to put aside things as medical issues and not really address them in the school setting. But when we take into consideration the child's whole experience of being in their body and what that's like, and how those medical challenges might be impacting their ability to focus or function in the educational setting, it gives us a lot more information that then we can more effectively support them. There's a lot of misinformation publicly available, so ensuring assessors have accurate and current information on FASD is really important. Another thing that I want to bring your attention to is test scatter. So having significant variability in test scores is really common with students with FASD and should never be dismissed. There's sometimes a tendency to look at scatter like that and think that the scores are invalid, and that is not true for this population. Behavioral measures often show significant differences between parent rating scales and the rating scales that are completed by the teachers. And this occurs for many different reasons. And again, is sometimes dismissed as not a school issue if the behaviors aren't seen there, or if the behaviors are seen as more extreme and at home than school. Sometimes they can be dismissed in this setting. And while the difference in environments should be taken into consideration, that information is important for the school to consider with regard to how to prepare for various situations that could arise in the future in the school setting as well, and should not be interpreted as the parents are just exaggerating their answers. I see that quite a bit with when there seems to be a kind of dismissing of the parent reports because, oh, they just exaggerated everything. When in fact, that's the reality of the situation that they're experiencing in the home. And that's something important to consider and look at the differences in the environments and what can be helped in one, how the environment from one the environmental experience from one location can then help inform the other. Another important factor to consider is when the student is able to demonstrate academic sufficiency when they're getting good grades, yet may still require special education supports and services in order to benefit from social interaction with peers or ensure they feel supported and are not in danger of dropping out due to mental health needs or physical or health needs that might be not effectively addressed. Also considering difficulties with self-regulation that can cause behavioral concerns and potential for undesired incidents at schools or school-sponsored activities, and functional skills that impact routine activities and daily living. So these are all different areas that the IEP can address. It doesn't have to be just grade oriented. And so those are important things to consider as we're looking at assessment results and then bringing that into IEP discussions. Ensuring assessments are multidisciplinary is really important, including the educators, the service providers like the occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, and also including families and caregivers as part of that multidisciplinary team is really an important piece. We want to be sure we're considering variability when analyzing test results because that's such a significant, it has such a significant impact with this population with regard to, again, those on days and off days. There's going to be a lot of variability in how they respond to testing and how what the results of the testing look like, depending on whether their brain was having an on day or whether it was having an off day. And so we really need to look at that when we're interpreting results. And again, that's a reason to compare the results of the testing with the classroom functioning and kind of compare and contrast and look at what works in those different situations and what doesn't. And as we work to translate the results of assessments into a supportive IEP document, we may need to consider making accommodations and recommendations for FASD-informed interventions that may differ from what the school typically utilizes. So while we don't have time to go over interventions in detail during today's training, FASD Now is a good resource that has a training topic, has training on that topic if you're interested in more about FASD interventions and what might be effective. And over time, students will improve on some abilities in some areas, and they may face new challenges based on new circumstances and new material that's required that requires different aspects of brain processing, right? So reevaluation on a regular basis is something I highly recommend. At a minimum, at the 3-year triennial, I would not recommend waiving the triennials for this population. I think having updated information is really important and can help fine-tune the IEP process. So one of the advocacy strategies that you can use is to create a parent report that really details your child's specific areas of need and how these needs are effectively and appropriately supported. And you can provide the team with this report in advance of the initial or any subsequent assessment so that it can be reviewed and considered in conjunction with all of the other assessment reports. You have the right to contribute in that way. You may also want to consider providing outside reports if they demonstrate your child's needs effectively and support or recommend provision of appropriate supports and services. That might be something you want to ask the IEP team to consider. Parent interviews and questionnaires are typically part of the assessment process. And when responding to interview questions, either verbally or in writing, it's important to be sure to use language that describes your child's challenges and needs as they relate to their brain processing and connect that to their disability, right? So connect each of their needs to the disability as you're talking and as you're discussing their unique challenges and strengths with the assessors. The language that you use to talk about your child and their needs impacts the school's understanding of the student's needs. So we want to really be considerate of the language we use. When assessment reports are being discussed, I encourage you to ask questions about the underlying brain processes that are associated with the testing results and how that translates to your child's academic, behavioral, social, and other educationally related needs. For example, if the assessment results indicate slow processing speed in both visual and auditory processing, you might ask how it will impact reading fluency or reading comprehension. You might ask how it will influence the child's writing with regard to essays and things like that that might be required in school. How will the processing speed in those areas impact their ability to do mathematics? How will it impact their social functioning? Okay. If we're not processing information at the same rate as our peers, that can definitely have an impact in how we relate to others. How will it impact their communication skills, their adaptive functioning, anything else you can think of? Being able to pull in that information that was identified in the assessments with regard to how their brain processes information and relate it to all of the different areas that are needed for them to be successful in their educational programming. And this information can also be used to decide which goals are needed, and we'll go into that a little further in a bit. And asking these types of questions facilitates effective translation of the assessment results into relatable descriptions of how your child processes information and then how that impacts their educational functioning. Thank you for attending this training. If you have any additional questions, need more information, or just want to keep up with Healthy Minds, please feel free to reach out to us. This slide has information about our website, our social media contacts, and a direct email to our founder and director, Kelly Rain Collin.